Yeah, hi everyone again, and welcome to our CSA Digital Email Summit. And the session for today is email tracking and EU privacy law. My name is Maike, and I'm responsible for the marketing and the events for the Certified Senders Alliance. Maybe you don't know the Certified Senders Alliance, or you are asking who's the Certified Senders Alliance. If you have further questions, please contact us after the webinar, and we will get back to you and give you more information about our certification and the other services we offer for you. And as you can see, we have two sponsors for our spring edition. First of all, it's the Martian and Harlon. Thank you both for supporting us during the spring edition. And dear attendees, if you have or if you want to get more information about our sponsors, you can find the sponsoring booklet in the download section in your control panel. And the housekeeping rules for today, it's a little bit different than the webinars before. You can ask your questions during the webinar and of course at the end too, but you can ask them live. So you have the function to raise up your hand and ask your questions live, or of course, you can also use the chat function in the control panel. It's up to you how you want to ask your question. And yes, as I mentioned, the session for today is email tracking and EU privacy law. And our speaker for today is Stephan. I'm glad I can now hand over to him. And but we have two questions at the beginning of the presentation. And of course, you will hear me and see me at the end of the session again. So if you have any questions you want to ask during the webinar, just use the chat function. Okay. So I just need to switch the moderation, right? Now you should be able to, yeah, perfect. Okay, then I will share the first question at the beginning. Dear attendees, I think you should see the question now. Do you use email tracking when sending marketing emails? Yes or no? We will wait a few more minutes until we have the answers, and then we will share the results. That looks good. Okay. Yes. And Stephan, you also see the results, or?
No, not really at the moment.
I think you should see them. We have, of course, 18% who are using the email tracking when sending marketing emails.
80%. Okay, yep. Great.
Okay. Then we have the second question for you. What data do you collect? I think we will wait a few more minutes again. Oh, not minutes, just seconds. I think minutes will be a little too much. Yeah, that looks good. Okay. Then I will close and share the results too. Half of the attendees only open yes, no, only open yes, no plus ID or other data. Do you see now the results, Stephan?
No.
Okay.
But that's fine. I understand what you just.
So yeah, then thank you attendees, and Stephan, you can start your presentation now.
Very good.
And yeah, we can see your screen. That's good.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I want to speak about a rarely looked at particularity of email marketing, which is email tracking, and its relation to European Union privacy laws. Let's start right away and look what we are talking about today. If you look at the European regulatory landscape for marketing emails, we have three main bodies of law that apply here. One is the ECommerce Directive, where you need basically consent for sending marketing emails to someone else, with the exemption that you can rely on an existing business relationship if you limit your marketing activity to same or similar goods or services as purchased before. Then we have the notorious GDPR, apologies for the typo here, it's not the GPDR, which governs the processing of personal data. Personal data is also an online ID, such as a cookie ID or a mobile advertising ID. So when you drop a cookie with a unique ID in it and you read that cookie ID, then you're within the scope of application of the GDPR already. The same applies to IP addresses, which are also personal data in the view of European regulators. The main concepts here, or one of the main concepts, is that whenever you deal with personal data, you need a legal basis. There are 6 of them. The 2 most relevant in this context are consent and legitimate interests. And then there's a third element of European regulations. It's called the ePrivacy Directive. You may know that directives must be implemented into national law, so it's not directly applicable law, but every European member state has implemented the ePrivacy Directive into national law. So you will find in every member state a law saying that consent is required for accessing information that is stored on an end user's device or storing information on an end user's device. Again, we are in the realm of cookies and other tracking technology. So when you use that for the purpose of email tracking, you're also within the scope of application of the ePrivacy Directive. We will now have a look at what this means in practice if we apply all these different legal bodies and the different regulations to email tracking. So the first one we will have a more detailed look at is the ECommerce Directive. It's the law that says that sending marketing emails requires consent unless you have an existing business relationship and fulfill all the other criteria to rely on that exemption. So generally, and outside of the exemption, you have to obtain consent, and consent must specify senders, beneficiaries of the consent, and goods and services. So it must be informed consent, as it is in the GDPR, as it is in the ePrivacy Directive. Partners must be named. There is no group company privilege. So if you obtain consent for a subsidiary in a group of companies, that does not mean that the parent company has consent. It does not cover email tracking. This is only about sending emails. So when you have that consent, you're not permitted to track. It's just the right to send someone an email. It's not the right to do something else, and tracking is something else. To obtain this consent validly, at least in Germany, you have to comply with a double opt-in requirement. This is not really written in the law, but the courts developed this to establish that the user who registered for a newsletter is actually also the owner of the email address with which he registered or she registered. So this is the well-known field of email marketing consent. We all know that, and you will probably better versed in dealing with the specifics of email marketing consent than I am. So let's move forward. The GDPR. The GDPR applies where personal data is involved, and we already saw that this applies to cookie IDs, to mobile advertising IDs, to IP addresses, also to device addresses. It will not apply if you just receive yes or no information, opened yes or no, without a link to a cookie ID or any other ID. So if it's really just adding up numbers, one more to the bucket into the bucket on the left side, or one more into the bucket on the right side, then you might be out of scope of the general data protection regulation. The main relevant principles here are you are required to have a legal basis. I already mentioned that. Consent and legitimate interests are the most relevant ones here. In some circumstances, contract performance also may play a role. Transparency is also one of the very basic pillars of the GDPR. Users must always know what you're doing with the data. This means you have to explain purposes, you have to explain who will receive the data, you have to explain everything around the processing of personal data, the legitimate interests you may pursue with it, the data subject rights, and so on. And there's a very important principle in the GDPR, and this is the principle of accountability, which basically means that whenever you handle personal data, whenever you process personal data, you have a burden of proof towards a regulator if the regulator wants to know if you're in compliance with the law. That means you have to have documentation about whatever you do with personal data, as otherwise you will not be able to prove that you act in compliance with the law. If we look at email tracking, there is little official opinion specifically on the matter of email tracking, but we have one quote of the Working Party 29, which is now the European Data Privacy Board. So the Working Party 29 expresses the strongest opposition to this processing, and this processing is email tracking, because personal data about addressees' behavior are recorded and transmitted without an ambiguous consent of a relevant addressee, which means that the only legal basis that the Working Party 29 believes may be sufficient here is consent. This is really very, very important. They say that legitimate interest is not an option here. If we look at how consent must be obtained, there are a couple of requirements. One is consent must be freely given. So linking consent to something else, such as access to a service, may raise legal issues. For instance, if you have available on your website a download, a white paper for download, and then you tell people, yeah, well, we need your personal data, and otherwise you can't download the white paper, then that might be such a combination where you should think twice about the legal implications. But at the moment, we have a bit of indication, so a court case here, a court case there, that a contract of, content against data might be an admissible thing. And also we have acceptance of the so-called pure model. You may have seen websites where you have the choice between paying a small fee, like €5 a month, and accessing for free, but then you pay with the data. This has also been accepted by some of the regulators in Europe, but others, such as the regulator in Berlin, are still very reluctant to accept this as a compliant model. So there is a gray area here, and it might raise concerns if you link a consent in a strict fashion to access to a service or a similar performance. Then the next thing is consent must be informed. So the user must know what he consents to, so the purpose of the data processing, third-party recipients of the data, and if we are talking about a potential influx of the data you collect with your email tracking into the real-time bidding ecosystem, where you want to use the CRM data that you generate through email tracking to build audiences, build segments for targeting the users later on in the internet, then you have a potential unlimited number of recipients. There are multiple actors involved, like demand-side platforms, data management platforms, supply-side platforms, and so on. And it must be, very carefully looked at how a valid consent declaration can look like in this context. Okay, this was already quite a start, I think. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we have one question.
Very good.
So far. I just read a question out loud. I'm not sure if Jax want to ask the question live or not. So given what you're saying here, why has the email marketing industry been so slow to consider consent when it comes to email open click tracking, and why are regulators not doing anything about it?
Well, I think there are basically two answers to that. So I start with the second part of the question. Why have regulators been so lazy to pick this up? The regulators are swamped with work at the moment, and this is clearly not a priority issue for them. So what they are doing, and they have also not looked into ad tech in more generally for years, and only now the pressure increases, and we see a lot of ad tech investigations throughout the continent. But this goes back to complaints that were filed in 2018 already. At the 25th of May 2018, when the GDPR entered into force, the first ad tech complaints have been filed with the ICO, the English regulator, with the Irish regulator, with the French, and also with the Germans. I think at the moment the regulators, they simply don't have the capacity to take care of everything. But I think once they take care, they will look into that. And then on the consent issue, we will look into the consent problems in a minute. But as far as email marketing is concerned, it's really not easy in a lot of use cases to actually collect that consent. So people try to, well, avoid that discussion unless they are forced to have that discussion. And I think this force can only, as in the ad tech industry, will either come from the regulators when they do something about it and look deeper into that, or if large players, well, in the ad tech industry, it was now Apple and Google, essentially, who, well, exerted pressure that results in a shift of the market and into new technology and things happening. But it took both. It took the regulatory pressure and pressure from, well, very, very large market players to get things moving here. So I think this is why nothing really happened so far. And it's, well, in a lot of cases, you will at least find solutions, and we will look at these a bit later, that try to cover these elements that I just mentioned in the consent declarations. So it's not that email marketing is always without consent. I see a lot of consent in the market. Good, let's move on. Consent options in the view of the regulators must also be granular ones. Granular consent means that if there are more elements to a consent declaration that are not intrinsically linked to each other, you have to offer means for the user to opt into one of these elements and refuse the consent for other elements. So for instance, if there is one consent, large consent declaration that is supposed to cover email tracking, email marketing, RTB data collection, so ad tech data collection, you should have 3 different checkboxes, and each of the checkboxes can individually be selected or unselected. So that's, I think, highlights also challenges in the email marketing industry to, well, do things in a compliant way. So the last element here, transparency. The regulators increasingly take the position that when you inform the user about the processing of data, you must provide information about the identity, not only of the entity that is actually the controller in this situation, but also about the identity of third-party recipients or third-party beneficiaries of the consent. So far, what you often see in the market is that we and our partners, or trustworthy partners, or our marketing partners, something like that, if this position that I just described, well, will persist in the market, then these partner languages are not possible any longer. For transparency and the information obligations, timing is also essential. So it must be at the time when personal data are obtained. We have a couple of court cases where the courts say, yeah, at the time means before the data collection starts, so that the user has actually, well, means to avoid the data collection. But that's also a bit of a gray area because the wording in the GDPR is slightly different. So it doesn't say before personal data are obtained. The last and third element of email marketing law is the e-privacy directive. It's also known as the cookie directive. It basically says that whenever you access information on an end user's device or store information on an end user device, you have to obtain consent, unless what you do is strictly needed for the provision of a service. So what you can do when you're a web shop is you can, of course, use a shopping basket cookie, because that's something that is technical functionality of the web store, and that's fine. That doesn't need consent. But whenever you drop marketing cookies, analytics cookies, things that have no relevance for the actual provision of the service, then consent is required. It only applies, and that's also a bit of a gray area, but I think we're 90% sure that it really only applies to data that is somewhere in the device. So an IP address or other metadata that is belonging to the traffic as such. So the communication, active communication, that's supposed not to be covered by the requirement to obtain consent. Interestingly, there is no legitimate interest option here. It's either strictly needed for the provision of the service, then you do not need consent, or not, then you need consent. The German law situation that we had until summer last year is not available any longer. Until that, the judgment of the Federal Court of Justice on the cookie consent 2 decision, there was a provision in the German Telemedia Act that basically says, well, for certain activities like marketing, well, analysis of the website and improvement of the website, you can place cookies on an opt-out basis. But the Federal Court of Justice in Germany, I think in late May last year or June last year, ruled, and rightly so, that this German law provision was not exactly in line with the European e-privacy law requirements. So they, well, reinterpreted the language so that now it's basically what is written in the European e-privacy law is the same situation that we have in Germany. Good. If we look at what this means in practice, well, we have basically three different consent requirements. So one is consent for sending the email. Then we have consent for processing personal data if you, well, use cookie IDs or mobile advertising IDs or something like that. And then we have consent for placing the cookies and trackers that allow you to work on the basis of IDs. So the last one in the mobile world, it's always basically always required. If you have a system that where a cookie does not contain an ID, you still need consent for placing the cookie, but you may go without the consent for processing personal data, because only where you have an ID that qualifies as personal data, you're in the realm of the General Data Protection Regulation. But these are the three different consent areas that must be covered by consent when you obtain a consent for email marketing, when you want to do email tracking. If you browse the internet, you will see a lot of different consent layers and consent mechanisms. The thing that I highlighted in the middle is a basic structure of how things could look like if you really want to comply with the law. The first checkbox is the email marketing consent. The second one is the cookie consent, and the third is the privacy consent, the GDPR consent. And here it is very granular. It's three different checkboxes. In reality, you often see that these are, well, combined into one or two. But you also see, and that's something that I think will be interesting to watch in the future, and how this plays out. On the screen here on the right-hand side, all these green little buttons, and each of these buttons represents one different recipient of data that is supposed to be entitled to process certain data collected when you browse a website. So this is not granularity on a more extreme level. So this list is over, I think, 300 entities long. So the user can, 99.9% of the users won't, but the user can go into this level of the consent mechanism and really opt in or opt out with respect to individual recipients of the data. And the same mechanic would also, well, be available here for, I think, 10 or 12 different purposes of data processing. So that's what we see in the area of online marketing at the moment. So ad tech, real-time bidding, and so on. It's an attempt of the industry to get along with the GDPR requirements and the cookie consent requirements. It's of course highly criticized by a lot of regulators. There's a lot of scrutiny on that system at the moment. But you see how granularity can play a role here when you collect consent, and that a one size covers all, the catch-all consent is likely to be invalid simply because it is a catch-all consent. So I already mentioned that the regulators are not really looking into email tracking at the moment, at least not in the marketing area. But generally speaking, the room for legitimate interests as a legal basis for the processing of personal data gets smaller and smaller. And a lot of authorities throughout Europe have made clear that the use of data that tracks behavior of users in the online world, as a more general term, requires consent. And then both the European Court of Justice and the Federal Court of Justice in Germany in the Planet 49 rulings confirmed that the cookie consent actually means consent. So that you cannot pre-select a checkbox, that you cannot do things like small banners at the bottom of a website. If you continue to browse, we will deem your consent to be given and stuff like that. So it must be a really hard consent where the user clicks a box, where the user does something actually to express consent. And the ECJ also confirmed that the users must be informed about the identity of controllers and further data recipients and the categories of data that is processed here. Interestingly, the thing that sits rightly in between traditional email marketing and display marketing is currently pending before the European Court of Justice. This concerns the InMail case, where a German telecommunications provider, displayed in an email inbox ads that looked like emails, but they technically weren't emails. So they were display ads that you could buy in a programmatic way. From an end user's perspective, probably not really distinguishable. So, and I think that's the point about it. So the end user was a bit tricked to, believe that these are proper emails, because the attention that the user would devote to real emails is probably a bit bigger than to display ads. So that case is currently pending before the ECJ, and it will shed light about what actually differentiates email marketing and display marketing. Is it a technical perspective? Is it an end user perspective? Is it the situation you're in when you're communicating with others? We don't know yet. So with respect to third-party leads, there is also an interesting consequence. If you use lead generators, you work with third parties to generate leads. Of course, you will have to require from this lead generator that the lead generator should obtain all these three consents for you as a marketer. So you always need the email marketing consent, you need the cookie consent if you use cookies for email tracking, and you need tracking consent, so the consent to process personal data if your cookies write unique IDs or read unique IDs. That means that your contractual guarantees towards the third-party lead generator should include everything of the above. So it's not only that they must ensure that a proper email marketing consent is there, they also need to ensure that you're allowed to use the trackers in your emails, because that must also be made transparable to the end user when the consent is obtained. Otherwise, it's not covered. Questions?
Hello again. So far, we don't have any questions. Dear attendees, that's your time to ask. As I mentioned before, you can use the chat function or the function to raise up your hand and then ask your questions live. So, yes.
Good. It gets more complicated if you want to feed your email tracking data into your customer relationship management systems and maybe even into your real-time bidding activities. If you want to feed your email tracking data into CRM data, and assuming that you have, like, let's take an example, you have two different data sources here. So one is the web shop that you have, where you may even have a login. There you can, well, it's rather easy to place a consent dialog. And you're also in a situation where you may be able to use quite a lot of data on the basis of legitimate interests. So that input channel is, I think, safe. You can build this in a way that it is legally compliant. But then it's very difficult to, if you send out emails, to get the consent that the data that is obtained through the email tracking can be combined with your CRM data. So it might be possible, and I think that's the best solution at the moment, that you already cover this when you ask the user for consent, when the user visits your web shop or registers for a newsletter or something like that, because that, when you obtain consent anyway, it's easy to just include the email stuff in there. If you do not obtain consent from the end user in the web shop and rely on legitimate interests only, then you have a problem. Because for the email tracking, as I've shown before, the Working Party 29 and most of the regulators are clearly of the opinion that legitimate interest is not an option. So you need consent, but how to obtain that consent? You cannot ask the recipient for consent before he or she receives an email. It's also very bad for any conversion rate if you, well, send an email, then ask for consent to drop a cookie, and only then a cookie is dropped, if that's at all possible from a technical perspective. So yeah, that's really a problem. What always is required, that you from the second channel also have a, well, legal basis to combine that data with other data you already have. If you want to feed your email tracking data into real-time bidding, into the ecosystem, also something that happens very often, then you need also consent that covers the profile building or audience building and the segmentation of the data you gather through that. And then you would also need to disclose the potential data recipients. As an advertiser, the list is probably not as long as it would be if you were a publisher. But as an advertiser, you will probably use a couple of demand-side platforms, agencies, maybe a DMP and a CRM system. And some of these, well, service providers may, from a GDPR perspective, not be data processors rather than joint controllers with you or controllers in their own right. So they need to be listed, and they need to be covered by a consent declaration. The shorter the list, the better. It's difficult to argue like that the consent can cover 200 or 300 different businesses and entities. But as I said, from an advertiser's perspective, this is manageable. What is very difficult is to find a contact to the user where you can actually ask for consent. What you also see in the market at the moment is, because there's so much pressure from Google and Apple on the existing third-party cookie ecosystem, that a lot of vendors in the ad tech world move to first-party IDs, and some of these are based on email addresses, actually, such as the LiveRamp ID. And if you ask the vendors of these IDs, then they will tell you, well, yes, we have consent because this is covered by the RTB consent that we actually collect, or our publishers collect when they ask for all the other consents. I think this is a dangerous argumentation, because when a user browses a website and then this consent layer appears, then the expectation of the user is that, yes, this is a consent declaration, but it will cover the, well, metadata of me using the website. So the URLs, the timestamps, whatsoever. If the users understand this at all, but if they understand it, they will assume that it's just about these, well, that data that relates to them browsing the website. And if they 10 minutes later register for a newsletter or buy something, and in the context of buying something, leave their email address, they won't have in mind that the consent that they initially gave is supposed to cover also the use of the email address in an RTB context. So I think it's worth being careful here. There are other first-party ID solutions that are not based on email addresses or well, use different technology where you might have not that much of an exposure. Good. That was it from my side. I was faster than I expected, but we still have time to discuss if you wish.
Yeah. Until now, we have no questions. So attendees, you can ask your questions. And as you can see, here are the contact details from Stephan. So if you have questions during the next days, of course, you can write him an email or call him, or you can contact us. And then we will hopefully answer your questions. I think that's it for now. So thank you, Stephan, for being part of our CSA Digital Email Summit. And yes, I think that's it for today. Thank you again. Bye.